My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in our thematic study. Now, I just want to make a point or two about how Paul continues his discussion of putting off the old and putting on the new. How Paul uses the words for corruption and mortality, etc., in a way that when we examine what he says, when he uses these identical motifs in all other passages, that he has not one word about biological change, but rather it is the transformation, the moral transformation from the life of corruption to the life of immortality, life in Jesus Christ. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, 53 and 54, and I want you to pay very, very careful attention to what he says here. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, this mortal must put on immortality. So, when the corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Now, here's something that's very, very important. You know, in the Greek, anytime that a word, a term, or phrase is used, the number of times it's used indicates its importance. 4 times in 2 verses, Paul says, put on. In direct contrast, of course, to the old body, the old nature, the old man. Now, this term, or this word for put on, is in the Greek endousaste, and it is an extremely rich eschatological word. The word itself is used some 27, 28 times in the New Testament. It can be used of mundane putting on of clothing, all right? It's used, however, in an eschatological sense in Matthew 22, when one of the guests who had been called in had not put on wedding garments. And as a result, he was cast out. Now, while the word endousaste does not appear in Romans, I want you to notice Paul's resurrection motif that he does use, and I will show how Paul, in his reference to resurrection motif, how he uses that in direct conjunction with endousaste in other texts that are clearly not related to biological substance. They refer to moral transformation. In Romans chapter 6, Paul says, do you not know that so many of us, as were baptized into Christ, were baptized into his death? Now, please catch the power of this. By baptism, there is a joining with Christ's death. Well, how important is that? Now notice, therefore, we were buried with him. And by the way, this Greek here, with, is, it's objectified. It's concrete. Paul is saying he died, we joined that death. He was buried. We were buried with him. Now, is it not obvious, however, Paul's not talking biological death of the believer, when the believer is buried with Christ in baptism. But watch this, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Well, Christ was raised from biological death very clearly, but Paul is also saying that Christ was raised to a new realm of existence. That's in verse 10. The death that he died to sin. So here Paul is saying he died, we joined his death, he was buried, we were buried with him, and just like he was raised to walk in newness of life, a different kind of life, a new realm of existence, even so we also should. Now that's in the subjunctive. Now watch this. If we have been planted together in the likeness of his death. Likeness of his death. No, we don't join Christ in biological death. He's talking about joining Christ, joining his death in baptism. If we have been planted together with him in the likeness of his death. Now watch this. This is where we begin to point directly to 1 Corinthians 15. And by the way, scholars have recognized this. If we have been united with him in the likeness of his death, we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. Now, let me ask you a question, folks. If the likeness of his death was being buried with him, if the likeness of his burial was being buried in baptism, then where do we get the idea, since joining with him in death was metaphoric, joining with him in burial was metaphoric, then where do we get the idea that being like him in his resurrection all of a sudden shifts gears to physical? No. These are, quote, spiritual likenesses, and yet they're very concrete. But now notice Paul's imagery of resurrection as he continues. Knowing this, that the old man. Now, do you suppose that old man is the first man, Adam? The image of the first man of 1 Corinthians 15? Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him. Well, does that mean that our physical body was physically crucified with Christ? No. We join with Christ in baptism. Now watch. In order that the body of sin. Now folks, this body of sin is the body of death of Romans 7 verse 24. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? It's the mortal body of Romans 8. And Paul says, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him. How was it crucified with him? By joining his death, being buried with him. Do you see the power of what Paul's saying? Now watch this. In order that the body of sin might be done away with. In order that we should no longer be slaves of sin. Folks, this is death. This is burial. This is resurrection. It's the putting off of the old man. It's the putting off of the old body, the body of sin, the body of death. And so Paul says, the death that he died to sin once, for all. But the life that he lives to God. Likewise, you also reckon yourselves to be dead indeed to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Now, folks, if this is not death, burial, and resurrection, I don't know what it is. And yet, for Paul, there is still a future aspect. What had been initiated in baptism would be consummated in the future. If we died with him, we shall live with him. Well, the death that they had died with him would be, may I use the term, overcome in the future. Well, was the death that they had died biological? No. Well, if the death that they had died with him by being joined with his death, if that was not biological, then the life that they would receive was not biological life. Well, I'm out of time. But Romans 6 is directly related to 1 Corinthians 15 and the putting off of the body of flesh, the body of sin, the body of the old man. Hey, be sure to join me in which we will look directly at Paul's language of putting off the old man, that body of flesh, that body of sin, and putting on, indusaste, the new man of immortality and incorruption. We'll see you on the flip side.